A leak that no one saw coming. There was a dad who never thought he'd hear his son's name again in a palace meeting. And now, Prince Harry is rushing back to Britain after a shocking news that has shocked both families. The leak in the winter message. The first jolt hit Buckingham Palace just after 9 o'clock on a dark December morning. The air outside was heavy with that grey-blue color that comes with late winter. Like the kind that hangs over the gates as a warning. As usual, things were getting back to normal inside the palace. Assistants were going over plans, private secretaries were moving between offices, and security staff were quietly sharing news. But something terrible had happened on the second floor, in a meeting room that was usually used for regular winter reviews. The training packet, which had been printed just minutes before, was in the middle of the long mahogany table. It was meant to be a summary of the week's domestic issues, public events, foreign letters, and updates on logistics before Christmas. Nothing exciting or out of the ordinary. But when the top assistant sat down at the table and started turning the pages, the mood changed. The room was dead quiet, so clear it could cut through the stale morning air. The assistant private secretary was the first person to notice it. He didn't recognize the lines on a page that was hidden in the middle of the stack. It was Section 4, Subsection B. A direction he had never seen before in a winter report. Mountbatten, Windsor, and Archie Harrison. Notes for learning. Keep this secret. It got cold in the room. No one spoke for 5 seconds. No one moved. No one was brave enough to turn the page. It didn't make sense. Archie was now a student in the United States and lived a very long way away. His education was private and not supervised by the king. There shouldn't have been any reason. So that his name would show up in a royal document. Where did that come from? It was whispered. No one picked up. The looks between the aides, each one more uneasy than the last, filled the room with a sinking fear. The person in charge of the sovereign's home office turned the page slowly, as if he were waiting for an explosion. What came next was worse than they all thought it would be. A short note about the details of the program. An outline of administrative changes and a reference to a file from before 2020, which is information that should have been deleted or officially moved out of the royal system many years ago. Not an outside break, but an inside one that destroys trust forever. A young digital historian who was pale and shaking and had only been working there for a few months was called right away. She looked over the paper with wide eyes. She said in a shaking voice that a digital folder from early 2020 that was wrongly labeled had been briefly unlocked for cross-departmental indexing during an internal reorganization of old family files in late November. It had transitional notes that were written while the Sussexes were working out their plans to leave. These notes were supposed to be removed, but they were filed wrong, electronically sealed, and then forgotten. Up until now. The helpers could feel the room getting cooler. There was no security breach. This was a huge mistake made by the organization. One high-level official leaned forward and pressed his hands against the table, as if to steady himself against the weight of the moment. He said quietly, "We will have a crisis that makes the spring of 2020 look like a walk in the park, if even one line of this gets out of these walls." Another helper took a deep breath. "Does the king know?" The answer was, "Not yet, but he will." The sound of the bare branches against the glass outside the window reminded the monarchs of the winter they could not escape. The Queen once said that storms are quiet before they get loud, and everyone could feel that this was the quiet part. The document was quickly retrieved, locked, and escorted using protocol that is usually only used for official issues. The doors were shut and the phones were put on the table face down. A choice was made. The king needs to be told before the end of the morning. There should be no secrets, whispers, or misunderstandings. Too much was at stake personally, and it had to do with a prince who had already cut off almost all official ties with the organization that held his son's private information. The assistants left the room, but the deputy private secretary stayed there and stared at the table where the training packet had been sitting just moments before. He could still feel how cold it was. The name that no one thought they'd see. The mistake that could not be fixed. King Charles was getting ready for a day of routine meetings in another part of the court. He had no idea that in just 1 hour, he would be faced with a breach that could bring back wounds that his family had never fully healed. Because one lost file had caused a storm in the winter quiet of Buckingham Palace. And 3 minutes after that, everyone would feel it. How the house got its hands on Archie's records. The winter briefing room was filled with fear, and it wasn't just because Archie's name was on a private document. It was caused by something much scarier, something that made top court officials face a truth they had tried to forget. The records of Archie's learning should never have been seen at Buckingham Palace, not in 2024, not after the Sussex family left, and not after Harry and Meghan decided to start a new life away from the Windsor family. Still, they were there. The palace had to go back to the foggy, chaotic months of early 2020, when the monarchy was being remade in real time, to figure out what had happened. The talks about leaving, which were privately called the Sandringham transition, happened quickly and with a level of complexity not seen since the 1936 abdication crisis. Meetings and emergency reports happened at the same time. Overnight, departments rushed to write up new rules. Some departments made changes to their tools. Some people frozen them. During that chaos, some files, notes, and transitional papers got lost. One of them was Archie's file. As soon as he was born, royal protocol said that any child in the line of succession, no matter how far away they were in real life, had to have a dossier in the sovereign's home office. It was a holdover from rules that were in place in the 1980s, when digitization first changed how the royal family kept records. The items in these dossiers were not personal. They were structural models made to plan for future issues related to schooling, ceremonies, and logistics if a child stayed in the royal family. Most of them were just empty notes, things that had to be done. But when Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020, they started a chain of events that the palace wasn't ready to handle. For safety reasons, internal systems had to decide which records to keep, which to delete, and which to send to other systems. This should have been easy, at least in theory. Politics, emotion, and an organization trying to understand a kind of change it had never seen before messed it up in real life. As departments tried to finish the Sussex portfolios, an overworked and overwhelmed administrative assistant tagged the placeholder dossier wrongly while searching through a digital archive that was created decades ago. It wasn't marked to be deleted or moved, instead, it was put in a transitional queue for updates that haven't been addressed yet. The mistake was small, couldn't be seen, and was forgotten quickly. However, computers don't forget. They wait. 4 years later, the lost folder showed up again when the sovereign's household office started re-indexing archived files on a regular basis. This is something that they do every winter. Even worse, its metadata was mixed with the current year's indexing protocols because of a mistake in the filtering process. This meant that when the winter briefing packet was made on December 4, the system saw the dossier as live contextual information and added it to the Section 4 summary. A mistake made from another mistake made from another mistake. When King Charles was told, the answer was already ready, and no one dared to make it less harsh. It was too harsh and honest to tell the truth. The monarchy, which is based on accuracy and tradition, had tripped over its own set of rules for how things should be done. The senior archivist stood in the king's study with both hands tightly clasped behind his back. He looked like he was trying to hold on to the weight of the moment. He said in a soft voice, "Your Majesty, the records were never meant to last. They should have been thrown away when Sussex changed hands. But at that time, the rules weren't clear. Some departments did things before others. Gaps were made." The room was very quiet as Charles listened. Even though his face didn't change, everyone there could tell that he was tired because the skin around his eyes got tight. He had spent the last year dealing with scandals, reorganizations, and splits within the company. It was almost too much for him to take in that his grandson had done something wrong that could be seen as careless or an invasion of privacy. "How sensitive is the stuff?" Charles asked. The librarian paused. "Very little, sir. Just notes." "But what does it mean?" "Yes," the king cut in, briefly closing his eyes. "The suggestion is terrible because it wasn't just what the file contained that was at issue, it was that it existed at all. In California, Harry had spent years building a life with clear, hard-won limits that he fiercely defended. Since stepping back, he had one goal in mind for every interview, legal document, and choice he made, to protect his family from the organization that raised him. Now the palace had to face a truth that would hurt him more than any news story. There were still traces of his son in the kingdom, not because they were mean, but because of bad management. And when there were already deep wounds in the family, carelessness could hurt just as much as meant harm. By noon, the palace had written its internal answer, but a message, an apology, or an explanation of how things worked could not change the fact that Archie's name was on a document that was sent to 10 people in the Crown's administrative corps. 10 people is too many. And a father in a different part of the world was about to find out that the institution he had left had never really left his kid. News storm, how the news got out to the public. The house hoped to keep the breach from getting bigger. They hoped that the find would stay in the quiet, frost-covered hallways of Buckingham Palace, where it would be handled quietly, thought about, and then forgotten before dawn the next day. However, quiet is easily broken in places this old. It's easy to crack. And it broke faster than anyone thought it would that December morning. The first message was an internal alert from the sovereign's household office to a top aide at Kensington Palace. The message was encrypted and shouldn't have been seen by anyone else. But because the assistant was in a hurry between meetings, she sent the alert to a second inbox that was handled by a junior employee. It was a simple mistake made by a person. The attached snippet, a redacted header referring to Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor school notes, was no longer behind the palace's safe firewall by the time the message got to the backup inbox. It was open to attack for 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, it was seen by someone inside the company who works with a media researcher, not by the press or anyone else from the outside. That was all it took. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, a journalist at a mid-level British news source, known for being able to smell palace tension almost uncanny with accuracy, got a tip. It wasn't a document or file, just a whisper of a headline. There are sensitive references to Archie's training in the internal palace briefing. Not many details or background, just enough to make you hungry. There were a lot of calls on the office phones by 4 o'clock. Editors disagreed on the words used. Legal teams told people to be careful, but the chance was too good to pass up. In December, royal news always had a lot of weight, but anything with Harry, Meghan, or their kids sent metrics through the roof within minutes. At 5:30, the first internet headline showed up. It was carefully worded and full of guesswork. A senior palace paper is said to talk about Archie's schooling. Buckingham Palace wouldn't say anything. It wasn't clear, was too complex, and was easy to ignore. And just because of that, it spread like flames. After only 10 minutes, 2 big British tabloid sites picked it up and made it more serious. The whispered story turned into a scandal that was slowly building up. The commentators started to ask tough questions. Why would the palace know something like that? Had rules about privacy been broken? Were Archie's files still being kept in royal systems? In 6:15, American networks took notice. Columbia Broadcasting System was the first to cut off an evening show to show a loop of breaking news. After that, Channel's news network asked a royal analyst to talk live on TV. It was all over social media in less than an hour. Driven by people who had seen Harry grow from a troubled child to a troubled adult, who remembered the pain of 1997, and who still felt sorry for Diana after her long, painful fight with the palace. People in America over the age of 50 responded with extra force. That the royal record keepers would touch a child who no longer lived in the hospital made them feel like they were seeing the same thing happen again. Harry had tried to get away from the past, coming back into the present. By 8 o'clock in New York, the story had changed completely. It was no longer about a paper that got lost. It was about what was seen as a breach of trust. The top correspondent for the news network on Channel said the line that would be heard all night, "This isn't an error. It's a sign that tells us why Prince Harry left." It felt like the world was closing in on the royal staff in London. As phones rang and screens updated over and over, press officers wrote, rewrote, and then threw out statements that didn't seem strong enough anymore. William's team worked quickly in the House communications room. They knew how stories got stuck together. Once the US debate set the tone, Britain would do the same. And once Britain did the same, the throne would be in a lot more trouble than just a small administrative error. By 930, people in the UK were publicly arguing about whether the palace had kept information about Harry's children on purpose. Some people spoke slowly. Others spoke out in anger. But it was clear what the tone was. The government seemed careless, out of date, and dangerously disconnected from the real world. In the US, Meghan's name was first top of the charts, then Harry's, and finally Archie's. Some late-night shows said they couldn't believe it. How could a palace lose track of a file about a child who doesn't even live there? By 10 p.m. London time, the story had hit California, which was the place the palace was most afraid of. 2 hours apart, Harry and Meghan saw the same story on their phones. Archie's school records may have been leaked by the palace. Before the monarchs could catch a breath, the news spread around the world. It got darker inside Buckingham Palace in the winter. In offices where workers moved in tense, purposeful silence, lights were still on past midnight. The king had been told. William had already been told. And had been told. The legal office was already writing up words for emergencies. But in a quiet Montecito home across the ocean, a father was looking at a glowing screen with a look that no one had seen in years. It was a look that meant he was leaving where he was. The story stopped being political as soon as Archie's name came up again, even if it was just by chance. It got close to home. Harry was about to do something. This was the call that sent Harry back to Britain. Harry got the message just before dawn in Montecito. The house was still calm and quiet from the early morning. The ocean outside was a dark, choppy blur, and the air in California was cool in a way that didn't seem right for the season. Harry had been awake for hours, which was a habit he had formed while in the service that was brought back to life by the constant pull of unfinished business. He had read about the storm in the news the night before, but he went to bed thinking it would pass by morning. It wasn't. His phone rang twice, and he knew right away who it was. London's private line had a royal code that was only used when there was a clear and present danger. Before the second ring was over, he answered. The person who spoke to him didn't do anything fancy. There is no protocol gap. There was only one senior assistant talking slowly and carefully, as if each word could set off a bomb. Sir, there was a mistake in the internal training. You may already know, but His Majesty thought you should hear the facts right away, before the news gets more intense. Harry didn't answer right away. He could feel the old stiffness in his chest loosen up. The kind of happiness he hadn't had since his life was split between duty and anger. It was farther down the hall than the bedroom, where Meghan was still sleeping, and the heater's soft hum could be heard elsewhere in the house. He said, "Tell me." The helper took a deep breath. During winter scanning, a transitional file from early 2020 came back to light. There were notes in it about planning Archie's early schooling. It was never meant to stay in the system. It should have been thrown away. Harry put his eyes shut. This was the worst excuse he could have thought of. He said in a low voice, "So the palace never let go. Even after I left." The assistant said in a tense voice, "It was a mistake. A mistake in the process, not a deliberate keeping. But it got passed around to several departments because it showed up in a private summary." How many? 10. 10. 10 too many. There were 10 possible holes in the structure that used to hold all the details of his life without any doubt. What else did the file have? He asked. Not much information. But the meaning is being changed online already. The news in the US has reported it as a planned hack. What does the palace plan to do about it? Stillness. They showed more truth than the answer itself. We are working on a clarification, but His Majesty thinks this talk needs to happen right away. He wants to meet with you alone. Harry felt the ground move under him, but it wasn't because he was angry or scared. It was because of something quieter and deeper, an urge he had ignored for years. Does William understand? He asked. Yes, sir. It was told to the Prince of Wales last night. He was, of course. The palace's order of things hadn't changed, even though Harry had left. When Harry hung up the phone, he stood in the dim hallway for a long time and let the silence settle. After that, he went into the kitchen, where the first rays of light were shining on the floor. Soon after, Meghan walked in wearing a robe and knowing everything without being asked. She told him, "It's real." Harry gave a nod. "It's even worse than the news. My dad also wants to meet." Meghan turned her head away, her face split between fear and anger. "Hey Harry, they got to Archie's information, even if it was just by accident. You told them they couldn't cross that line." Slowly, he breathed out. "I understand," she said in a soft voice, "and you're going back." Not as a question, but as the truth. He said, "Yes. I need to." There was no longer any talk of the monarchy, duty, titles, or tabloid cycles. There was only talk of a child whose name had been called in a room he should never be tied to again. By noon, plans were already being made. A single seat booked through diplomatic means that isn't known to anyone. There was no entourage or press around him, it was just a father going back to face the organization that had let him down before. And was now too close to his son. By the time it got dark, Prince Harry was on a plane headed for Britain, bringing with him a storm that the palace wasn't ready for. Prince William, Queen Catherine, and the winter reckoning. The palace divide. As soon as Harry's plane entered British airspace, the mood inside Kensington Palace changed from a calm state of worry to a sharp, icy alertness. It wasn't dawn yet. The house was covered in a thin layer of frost that made it hard to hear and made every step feel heavier, but you could feel the anxiety inside. William had been told about it hours before. The early winter darkness pressed against the tall windows as he stood in his private office. A dim light from a single lamp lit up newly printed reports, digital sentiment analyses, risk forecasts, and the internal summary that started the whole thing. Archie's name was written once and mentioned twice, which was enough to start a firestorm around the world. William put down the papers and pinched the bridge of his nose, as if that action could make what was happening less scary. He was sure Harry would show up. Even if it wasn't meant to be, he knew that the breach had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But Harry's anger wasn't what bothered him the most. Harry was in a hurry, which meant his brother wasn't going to come ask him what was going on. He wanted to know the truth. Catherine walked in without saying anything, which was a habit she saved for times when she didn't feel like being polite. She wore a warm sweater in the winter. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and her face was calm but heavy with something else. "Is it certain?" she asked. William said, "Yes. He's already in the sky." Catherine let out a soft breath. The light from the lamp caught in her breath, making it seem like even the air today had weight to it. She moved towards him. "The papers on the desk are being looked at with shifting eyes." She said that this should never have come up again. William agreed that just the time makes it seem cruel. He did nothing but stare at the paper again. It was the careless indexing mistake that brought up a story they had been trying to forget for years. He knew how strongly Harry looked out for Archie and how much he didn't trust the government. And how quickly one slip-up could break the thin bridge that was still there between them. "Does the king know that he's coming today?" Catherine looked up. William said that he was told as soon as the plane got out of Greenland. He would like the meeting to be quiet. There was no press or conference, it was just the three of them. "Where are we now?" she asked. William didn't answer right away. He walked over to the fireplace and put one hand on the ledge to feel more grounded. He had spent the last few years balancing between personal chaos and public order, between grieving with his brothers and upholding the Constitution. Now, an unwanted, unplanned, and uncontrollable problem had come right into their winter. William said in a low voice, "It depends on how he gets here. Things will get worse for everyone if he comes to blame." She then asked, "If he comes to understand?" William shook his head no. Harry hasn't learnt anything in a long time. When something is broken, he comes. Catherine looked at him for a long time, and for a moment her face softened with a kind of understanding she didn't usually let herself show. "He is scared, William. That file is more than just a leak. It tells him that the house hasn't really let go of him or his kids. That sounds like a threat to a parent." William briefly shut his eyes. He agreed with her. He also knew that this storm had been caused by the institution's cold, procedure-based machinery, which often didn't care about how it affected people. There was another truth, though, that neither of them spoke out loud. Harry wasn't the only one who felt like the past was still alive. The way Catherine touched the edge of the reports was soft, like when you touch a scar. Do you think the king knows how far Harry could go with this? William's jaw got tight. He thinks he is. You don't, though. William told her no, because this time it's not about jobs, roles, or interviews. It's about a kid outside. The first dim light of dawn broke through the darkness and cast a pale, brittle light over the frost-covered ground. It was the kind of cold morning that showed everything. There were cracks, shadows, and facts that no one wanted to face. He saw Catherine look at him. What are you going to do when he gets there? Get to know him. William said. Before the king does. She agreed, not being shocked. William had always been the one to keep his family away from the fire, even when it was taking his brother's face. But before she could answer, a helper quietly walked in the doorway. Sir, the plane has come in. He's on his way. William and Catherine shared a look that didn't show fear or dread, but rather a serious recognition that the next few hours would change everything. However, Prince Harry didn't rush back to Britain because he felt he had to. He did it because someone had crossed a line that could not be erased by absence. Now, winter had brought the brothers together. The comeback that changes everything. Around noon, the sky over London had turned into a pale, wintry haze that made the city look softer but made people who were waiting for news feel more intense. The gates to Buckingham Palace stayed closed, and the guards didn't show any emotion. The public had no idea that one of the most delicate family reunions in recent royal history was about to happen inside those walls. Prince Harry had arrived. He was driven through the quiet streets of the morning by a black car with covered windows and a route that was meant to be hard to see. There were no cameras, motorcades, or ceremonial guards. There was just a son going back to the place he used to call home and a father getting ready for a talk neither of them had planned. Inside the castle, King Charles waited by himself in his own room. He had a cup of tea sitting next to him, unopened. He fired advisors, put off meetings, and locked the door because he knew this wasn't a political or constitutional issue. This man was a father who had lost his son twice, first to grief and then to distance. When Harry walked in, there was a heavy quiet that didn't feel hostile or cold. Instead, it was heavy with years of unanswered questions. Charles slowly got up, a sad and tired look on his face. Harry. It was a soft voice. At first, Harry didn't answer. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the things that were familiar. The picture of his grandma, the winter flower arrangement, and the thick drapes that framed the cold courtyard. All of these things were reminders of a life he used to have much more confidence in. They felt like things from the past. After that, he spoke. This place should never have had Archie's name on it. Charles gave a nod, and the lines on his face got deeper. I understand. Harry took a step forward, and even though he had been trying to stay calm, he felt his emotions rise. You kept things about my son. After everything. After we left. After we told them we wanted to be alone. You kept him close. Charles took a deep breath. It was a mistake, not a choice. That's exactly why I'm here, Harry said, his voice rough from being hurt. William was waiting across the palace in a room next door. He was walking quietly with his hands behind his back. Advisors stood outside the hallway and pretended not to hear the faint sounds of steps, raised words, or broken glass. But no one came. Even though the subject was very important, the talk stayed incredibly calm. Charles talked about the problem with the way things were handled, the old digital records, and the lack of control. He admitted that the monarchy's internal machinery was still getting used to modern needs. It was still too rigid and taking too long to get rid of old ways of doing things. Harry listened with his jaw clenched and eyes blurred with shock and sadness. Finally, Charles said, "It matters that no harm was meant." Harry replied, "But harm was done. Again, my family has to pay for what the palace did wrong." The words stuck with me. Not as a charge, but as the truth. William quietly let out a breath in another room. That tone was familiar to him. Harry had stopped yelling because the pain had grown deeper, past anger and into a state dangerously close to giving up. Neither the father nor the son spoke for a long time. Then Charles asked Harry, "What do you need?" Harry didn't think twice. "A promise that nothing else with my kids' names on it will ever be inside these walls again. Not in a file, a briefing, or a cache that you can't find." Charles slowly nodded, and the promise felt like another heavy winter blanket on his shoulders. "I promise." Harry didn't change how he looked, but something inside him seemed to calm down. And there was a quiet shift. They knew the answer would never be perfect, but it was something. William walked into the hallway when he was ready to leave the room. They looked at each other. It wasn't forgiveness or reunion, it was just an admission that their story wasn't over yet. Outside, a thin layer of frost made the palace garden sparkle. A father had told them. One boy had asked. A family that was split up by distance and loss had taken one more impossible step towards the next part of their story. It was a quiet winter morning, and Britain let out a sigh of relief. They knew that even in the most famous family in the world, the biggest fights are always fought behind closed doors. Always had a fight.